This scene I created using a combination of projected images onto the terrain, rendering out and using camera projection, and then adding layers of ecosystem, re-rendering, and applying those maps onto the terrain. Also keeping some of the vegetation elements in order to keep depth and improve some of the shadow quality. It also leaves it open for animation within the scene while having a very minimal amount of materials being used because of the camera projection. Not only did I use renders, but I've also incorporated some different images to overlay on top of the maps and the images I rendered out to reproject onto the terrain. Also making some modifications to the bump and then creating different materials that way. The atmosphere was rendered separately, using the same scene and lighting settings in order to keep everything consistent, but to not have to render out the atmosphere with any sort of test renders or on the way, since there was really no point in doing that. I also did some of the atmospheric effects within post using the Z depth and also some of the different masks that were rendered out and the alpha channels. For the ecosystem, I used a combination of painting and also standard ecosystem population. Mixing those two together, I was able to create some nice variations and be able to judge scale a little bit better throughout the overall image. So if we take a look at this scene and the starting point, what I have are two terrains, two standard terrains. So these are just height field terrains, and I just have them intersecting each other. If we take a look at what is basically the foreground terrain, what I used was a combination of the erode effects, also going in and manually painting some of the different sections. And I also started with a procedural terrain originally to create some of the different details, and then converted it to a standard terrain to start applying some of the different erosion effects. The terrain in the back, which is actually in the center of the other terrain, it's just about exactly the same terrain with some additional modifications made. Because I've rotated it around, scaled it on the z-axis, and of course shrunk it down a little, you don't really see a complete repeating pattern. But my main goal was to create more of an eroded terrain where I'd have a little more control, not just using one terrain, but having two. And by exposing the rock and using the same terrain for the rock and the grass, that way there's a smoother transition between the eroded sections. I used a fairly basic material setup for the underlying layer, and this is just a preview render of this. And I'm really, if we just take a look at the material, I have two layers, and this is for the more foreground terrain, the underneath terrain, where I'm using the vegetation preset that comes with view. And then I made a few modifications to the color, changing what was currently set as part of the preset. And then I'm just overlapping some of the brown sand material to really show up more on steeper areas, which you can see more on the right and on some of the spots on the left. The other terrain object, I use still the vegetation preset to apply more on the flatter areas, just like the other, but underneath is a rock material that I created, which is a combination of a couple of different functions blended together using some turbulence to create a nice rock preset to start with. So once I rendered this out using a square image, and if you remember the final output, I did have a widescreen where I did have all this cut off. So I wasn't too concerned about the distortion here in front, because my original intention was to make it more of a widescreen view, but just to have it square render for ease of projection, but also to have a little bit extra in case I wanted to shift the camera. Once the image was rendered, and here is the final, viewing it at 25%, the image size for this is 4K. So I rendered it out as a 4K image, and I do have shadows being cast onto the terrain object from itself and from the other terrain. And because of this, and wanting to continue stacking on top of the layer, I did a little tiny bit of post where I removed a lot of those dark shadows, but still kept some of it within the scene. Now I could have rendered it out so that those shadows weren't there, and then maybe added them in later. But in this case, I did intend on using them to blend some of the elements. So after I modified this, what I was able to do is just project it onto the terrain. And we can see there are some errors in the texture and material overall, but this is just the underlying layer. And when I was creating this, I fully intended to cover everything with different ecosystem plants. These were just really wanted it to be there just in case any little spots kind of shone through, and that way there was something underneath that looked somewhat interesting. And the main way I got from the original render to this one, and this is not multipass, this is just the straight color output. What I did was primarily use the shadow and highlight filter in order to pull out a lot of the color and reduce the shadows. And a real good indication of how that being used is you can see a lighter glow around the terrain objects up on top where it starts to blend into the atmosphere. And that's kind of a high pass thing that tends to happen. And since the shadow and highlight filter is similar to a high pass, you'll be able to see that kind of outline. But of course, the atmosphere I wasn't really worried about, so that showing up doesn't really affect a whole lot. I also rendered this out using radiosity, but a very small amount and using lower quality settings. If you take a look at the atmosphere editor of this scene, you can see that I have radiosity turned on using indirect sky lighting. I do have optimized for outdoor rendering turned off. The reason for this is you can generate a lot more detail, especially for this type of a terrain in a smaller scene. And it does take a little bit longer to render, but you end up with a better looking indirect lighting pass. So the next step was to reset the materials or remove the existing material. And if I open it up, we can take a look at the settings. And what I'm using is a tool designed, this is part of Snowflake, it's called Matte Painter, which sets up camera projection methods and incorporates using aspect ratio or using pixel size to control the projection. But to set this up manually, we could add in, and I do want to close that out, add in a texture map, and then change the UV coordinate to camera projection. And I'm just using the main camera on this one. And I also have the interpolation type set to bicubic, which is pretty typical for a still render, where we're not going to be creating an animation out of it, and we don't want any anti-aliasing, and overall it makes a pretty good blend. So then you can connect the color to that output after loading in the image and be able to project onto the object. Now, because there's two terrains, I had to set that up twice. So I just have the exact same setup on another material, where this one's called rocky terrain. Overall, I still have cast and receive shadows turned on, and the diffuse is set to 60 and 40. Contrast level at 11. So these are basically the default settings for most materials within Vue. It gives me the ability to receive the shadows from the vegetation I'm going to be placing on it. So we can see some pretty dark areas where the existing shadows were. And I do have radiosity on. And because the atmosphere is stacking onto the object more than once, it does end up being a little bit darker. If I was to ignore lighting and the atmosphere on both of these, you can take a look, and we would just basically see the render. But we wouldn't receive the shadows from any ecosystem that we would add on top of it. Now, this version is not of the post-modified render. It is just the initial render with the harsh shadows, which is why they were so dark. And in the next step I made, if we take a look at the terrain I've called lush foreground, we can see the ecosystem showing up. And so what I did was select the terrain main material and the projection, check ecosystem to add in the ecosystem layer. And I've just loaded in this case I only have 4 plants within this main population. And these are plants from the Xyloplex ground cover collection. And I just have a small amount of density. I am decaying near foreign objects so that that intersecting terrain will kind of push away the population. And then the overall amount of populated ecosystem, I've got full altitude range and slope range, and the total amount of instances is only 3,000. So this I wanted to be kind of the base ecosystem to add on the top of the material. This is something that these wouldn't stay in the scene at all times. I just wanted to be able to build up on top of the original render and just add a little more variation to it. So you can still see a lot of these brown patches showing up. And of course there's no ecosystem on the back part of the terrain. So this step was very quick. It was just a matter of loading in the population for the ecosystem. And just adding in plants. And then just changing some of the settings, but not many of them, just populating. So after that, I rendered it so that I could have uh, a new image to map onto the terrain. And after adding a couple of more plants, I just increased the population of the ecosystem, just adding in one more plant. And we've got a pretty nice coverage overall of the terrain. I'm going to change this to a different view mode. And basically what I have is just the population in front of the camera. So what I was able to do was start out, first we'll take a look. After adding in the population, I decided I wanted to paint in a little bit more. Well, with this ecosystem layer, you can select Paint, and then paint directly from this ecosystem. So rather than having the overall population where you click the populate button or using dynamic population, you can set it up as a material-based ecosystem. And then all of those different plants that you have as part of that become available for either adding a single instance of choosing randomly from the list by using a bit of everything, or only the selected item, which would be whatever is selected in the list. So then you can add in single plants, or you can switch to the brush and cover larger areas, and you can paint that in. You can also do that in any viewport. I do want to note, when you're using the perspective view painting, the best way to use the perspective view is to place a single instance as a reference of scale, position, and continue brushing within the top view or other views. The reason for this is the perspective view can be a little touchy, and there is a known bug that kind of pops up every once in a while. Sometimes it's fixed in newer releases, and then I've noticed it gets broken again. What this bug is basically when you paint with the brush mode, instead of using the solid growth technology, which is growing new plants where everyone looks different, it ends up generating and creating several duplicates of the exact same plant. And that can really create some awful looking setups, and having plants really, really close together that are just the same plant duplicated over and over. So to avoid that, you can paint in the top view. This is also something that can happen in Xtreme if you're running this through another application. So it really is, I've only seen it show up within the perspective view. So if you need to use the perspective view for mainly just kind of placing a single instance just for judging scale or picking out a point, and then finding that vegetation on the top view. So using the two back and forth can be very useful. Another thing is possible is just by using the global ecosystem. And right now I have the ecosystem painter open where I only have one plant loaded in. But if I was to add in more, or continue the list like I had for the material-based ecosystem, what you can do is, if you decide you want maybe a new distribution, but you don't want to lose that ecosystem, so you kind of want to clear out the ecosystem painter, you can go into the ecosystem selector, and what you could do is select all of the instances or just maybe a few of them, and under manipulate, or the little tab next to manipulate, you can choose to either convert all of those instances into any of the current ecosystem instances loaded into the scene, or you can move them in between a material ecosystem that's available or the global. So if you had painted some stuff on the material ecosystem, you can move them over to the global, which is just the main painter that we access from the main part of the interface. Or we could take painted ecosystems from the global ecosystem and move them to a specific material. Now, in doing so, it's really important to know that when and if you use the populate button, it will delete everything. Everything that is stored within the material ecosystem is reset and repopulated when you click populate. So even if you've painted stuff in and painted in anything, repopulating will destroy it. So this is the multipass output from that scene with that lower vegetation. And what I have rendered out is all of the shadows. So we've got both the shadows of the terrain, at least the lower terrain in this case, because shadows were turned off for the back terrain, which is another benefit of being able to turn off or have the intersecting terrains or two separate terrains around the same amount of space. And of course, the z-depth, the XY normal. If we take a look at the diffuse lighting, we've got a lot of detail and variation in there that can be extracted for specific composites. Distance to camera plane, which is not showing correctly. The indirect lighting pass can be really useful for just preserving the pure color of the vegetation. Since there were no changes made to the back terrain, that's still just the image. But if you take a look at the front, very little amount of diffusion, and we really just see the total color. So without the shadows turned on, you can have that nice amount of light. And of course, that is an overlay. So that is a combination of not only the indirect lighting, because if I turn that off, we start to see it get a little darker. Ambient is basically just that back terrain. The specular is a slight amount of change on some of the flowers. If we take a look, just a tiny amount showing up from the bump on the petals, and also other areas in different plants. With the diffusion is a lot of the color. And now what I have showing at the moment is one of the material layers. So this is the underlying material being cut because of the overall ecosystem distribution. So anywhere the ecosystem is showing up is showing as black. Now, if you take a look at what that's done to the render, cutting that out, you'll notice a lot of little X's everywhere. That is a fairly common artifact to show up within alphas and masks when blending a lot of the different materials. So a lot of the times the direct render becomes kind of useless because of that anti-aliasing artifact. And sometimes some of the passes aren't entirely useful, although you can do a little bit of modification to them and really pull a little more out of it. So now we can see there's also the rocky material output or object output. Because in this case we have the rocky terrain, and then also the lush foreground, which is technically the object pass. Now the reason we're seeing mainly just the material is that because the ecosystem would be considered a separate object, not all of that is showing, and it's cutting it out. So now we can also see that the ecosystem is a separate pass and available within the multipass options. So you're able to really easily composite just the ecosystem onto parts of the image. We can see the color directly behind it, which would be the full render. And you can also see, because I did use a little tiny bit of perspective view brush painting, that there are very close and tight duplicate instances where some of them are drastically repeating themselves similarly along these lines. And even though those passes were kind of moving around a bit, it did create some objects that are very close to each other. So you can see if we wanted to, we could just overlay some of these different elements, create different blending modes, extract all of the shadows. And I created some adjustments and taking some of the layers from the multipass to lighten up some of those shadows and create some different masks for the area. If we take a look at some of these layers, I just have kind of a lighter version. I didn't really use any special brushes because none of that was really showing up, and just use different areas to modify the overall ecosystem. So then taking this image, I map that onto the terrains and still have just a few ecosystem instances showing up. And basically these are primarily the painted ones, some of those in front, those small plants. And then there's still a few left over, 287 on the material layer. So this is just with the applied edited render and remapped, with some of the plants showing up in a couple areas of the scene, mainly just to blend the terrains together, because I'm only projecting this map onto the foreground terrain, which means once it hits the intersection of the central terrain and the one that's showing up in the back of the render, there's going to be no plants and it's just going to get cut off. So by leaving just a few in the scene to render, you can increase performance overall, but not have that really fine line. So just leave a few in the scene, and that works pretty well for these intersections. Once the basics of the foreground were finalized, I decided I want to have a little bit of a flatter area to put some vegetation on in the back. So what I did was I added a terrain to intersect with the rocks. So if we take a look at the scene, it's really just kind of stuck in there. I just found a place where I'd be able to create a nice little flat zone and then end up with something behind it. And I had a couple of different versions and ideas for this, and this is one of the other terrains that's showing up right now that's hidden. But this is just a small change where I added another terrain and was able to just focus on rendering this. And since all of the other vegetation has already been rendered, is just part of the image map, this all went really quickly. So if I do a preview render, we can see just how quickly everything is rendering out the rock itself, and now with this back material layer, I did do a little bit of a overlay of some rock onto it, just to improve the look of it, since I had started with a pretty low quality texture map to begin with, and also standard terrain, which doesn't have a whole lot of detail. at least at this resolution with some of the effects I did. In order to get it to kind of shear away on the edges. I did lose some of the detail, so I just used a kind of a rock texture to overlay on top of that. So setting that up becomes easier and easier as you move along through these steps and re-render and apply maps. So wanting to improve not only the intersections around the two terrains, but also starting to apply the ecosystem on the back terrain. I now started in this version of the scene. The next step is basically painting on even more plants and part of a new ecosystem layer of the back terrain. So just using the painter on the brush mode, just going in there, adding in plants where I wanted them. If I needed to see something, go into the perspective view, see how it would look from the camera view, and just adding a little more vegetation to the scene. But of course not having to worry about the foreground terrain. I also started to make a few modifications to the lighting, which overall becomes a little more orange or red looking. And then I added some more plants to the painted or global ecosystem, just kind of building up on the scene that way, the overall amount of instances really increasing, just to really fill everything in. But not a whole lot of changes from the last step of the file, or the scene rather. And I did add in just one larger plant to kind of fill in a zone or a peak on the back. And I do have some roots kind of sticking out of one of the mountainous areas. I originally intended on maybe putting some trees over on this side, but did decide against it just to leave it more open. So instead I just kind of had the roots coming out of one portion of the terrain, which you can see in the final render. And I did create some oversized flowers just to pull out some color in the back of the scene. But this version of the scene is basically the final part rendered in view. And after this point, really the rest of it, everything is done in post. The overall coloration of the scene is much different than the final. So right now, really just the vegetation on the back and around the edges. And that's really the only vegetation in the scene, and a few plants in front, just to give it a little more depth in case I wanted to move things around. We can see a very harsh seam between the two terrains over here on the left, and that was just something I decided to take care of in post. So the last thing I needed was the sky to be able to put behind everything. And what I decided to do was just basically to hide all the terrains from the scene and clear out all of the ecosystems. So what you can do is open the ecosystem painter and hit clear, and that will remove anything that's been painted. Same thing with the material layers. You can go in and it looks like I just basically removed the ecosystem layer. So if we had an ecosystem, you can select it, delete the layer. Since I have so many different versions, I didn't really have to worry about deleting it and needing to come back. I could always go back to a previous version of the scene, which is why there are so many files for this. It's because for every step of the way, I wanted to make sure if something happened, I could always go back and pull something out of it if I needed to. So after that, it's really a matter of just taking it into post and compositing everything together if I need any extra elements. But the main changes I made were really to the coloration, and of course adding in the sky. Since some of the seams were showing up so much, and we can really see some harsh lines between the two different terrains, what I did was go back to the first render I did with all the vegetation and the full coverage and took out uh, that render pass where it's just the ecosystem. After making a few color changes to the main render, I then just took a mask using one of the available masks, kind of changing it a little, but basically just cutting out the ecosystem along those seams where originally it was covering up that back terrain. And of course, in a few places, kind of leaving it open. But you can see a big difference in the way that looks. And since that render was already completed and part of the scene, it was very easy just to use that to fill in those seams and not have to worry about any major editing. And now after doing a little more color correction on the render, I also took some of the different cloud renders, and this is some of the different layers I created, just loading in some of the presets I've made, rendering that out with the same scene so that the lighting was exactly the same, just adding in various cloud layers and tweaking things slightly. Because since I didn't have to worry about the lighting of the rest of the scene, I could really do whatever I wanted with the clouds, just as long as the sun was staying in the same place. So then I was able to just take the mask from that final render and apply that to this cloud. So I have the mask right here, and I'll go ahead and actually in this case, this is partially, it looks like the Z depth, which I did end up using for some of the atmospherics. When I set that to the screen mode, you can see that fill in a little more. So if I was to take this cloud layer and put it on top, be able to adjust the haze amount by using the screen mode, screen blending mode with the Z depth, just to increase that. And I did end up using some different tools to make it look a little better. So on top of that, I've also taken that Z depth, and in this stage, basically I blurred the map and added a mask to it to separate the different zones in different areas, and just setting up the same effect where I just have the screen mode on, added more to the atmospheric and volume of the atmosphere to make it blend a little more with the cloud layer. I also made it slightly more realistic by overexposing the clouds in the background. Even though realistically with this much light, the sky would basically be almost washed out. So I did want to make it more closer to a photograph, but still somewhat kind of faked. And in this file, you can see the main changes between the compositing steps. So basically, here is the render and the last render I created, where I have the projected image of the forward ecosystem and the foreground ecosystem. And then the actual ecosystem in the back with the projected map onto the terrain. and then I added in the atmosphere in the background. And here are all the changes that I made to the coloration and overlaying the Z-depth to create an atmospheric effect. And I used some other filters as well within Photoshop to make things kind of glow a little bit better and give some nice coloration overall. I did like more the blue tone as opposed to the really harsh orange. And then you can see without the clouds in there. But overall, I think it turned out fairly well. And some of the filters I used, third-party plugins for Photoshop. That's basically called Flare, which is a really good set of tools and filters for Photoshop. Now I want to go back to basically the starting point scene and just show a couple of techniques when you're working with camera projection. A couple of things that could be really helpful for either using camera projection within an animation where there's going to be camera movement or setting up some different composite renders. Now, this is the stage of the scene where I have the vegetation from the foreground terrain being projected on with some of it left over, still nothing on the back. What I'm going to do is clear out the painted ecosystem instances in front and then go into the material and clear that ecosystem as well. Just to stick directly with the image and take a look at the main part of the scene without the plants. To make the scene a little more versatile for animation and being able to change the camera position, we have to keep in mind that because we have projected cameras, and that is the primary way the maps are being applied, there will be stretching. So what I'm going to do is just create a copy of this camera that I have right now. And first, move it around the scene so you can see how the maps look from other perspectives. So this is kind of farther away, and you can see where the main camera is located, just about right here, and the projection along the sides, where we have a lot of stretching around the edges. So we're going to go back in and look at a closer part of the main render area. So you can see once the camera is moved, really can't do much with the way it's currently set up. Because most of the projection is showing up on vertical elements. So once we move above the terrain and have that change, we just have so much stretching. And that becomes really difficult to animate with this method with just having one camera projection. So there are other solutions. And if you find you need more detail in one area, it's really easy just to set up another render of the original terrain, or even with the ecosystem just going through the different stages and steps along the way, the different files, and then you can either remove elements from the scene to preserve the camera and merge it, or one thing I like to do is just to record the position and orientation, and also keep in mind the focal of a camera. And then you can save out either a metanode or just recopy the data over. So if you want to create a metanode, the easiest thing to do, what you would need is position, orientation, and then also the focal. Focal length is divided in half. So in order to get a focal length of 45 millimeters, you need to type in a value of 90. We can type in a constant number, plug that into the focal. Oh, and sorry, it is divided, divided by 2. So we would type in a value of 22.5 and then get 45 millimeters, which is what we currently have. So you could set this up adding in a constant vector and another constant vector, one for position and one for orientation. And then go over into the numeric tab and just copy over the current positions. And I also wanted to make a note about the way the coordinate system works with vectors. That is entirely dependent on the internal unit of the scene. Right now the internal unit is 0.1. So if we go to the Units and Coordinate tab under File and Options, we can see the internal unit is 0.1 meters. That means the vector needs to be, you need to move the decimal point over 1 in order for it to be correct. And that's only when you're typing in the value manually. If you were connecting objects, then obviously that vector stays correct. And connecting graphs that way, it doesn't really matter. But if you're typing in the amount, then it would need to be, just move the decimal point over 1. So in order to get these values, that's really all we need to do. And there we have position. So now we could also do the orientation. Orientation is not affected by the internal unit. The value between 0 and 360 stays constant. Orientation works different than a continuous vector that could go on forever. Orientation is always constrained between 0 and 360. So we can type in those values to be exactly what is showing in. Oh, and I did delete that. Okay. So now we also have the orientation, we have the position, and we have the focal. So the easiest way to really get this into another file, another step along the way, is just copy all of these nodes. And first what I want to do is connect the position and orientation. By doing and making these connections ahead of time, instead of doing it within the metanode, we don't have to add any additional nodes. They'll automatically be created because the links are already there. So we can select these 3 nodes and just click Metanode. And this is for version 7 and up. If you're using version 6 or 5, you will just need to copy over that data. And the internal unit wasn't added until version 7. So you really wouldn't need to worry about it anyway. So if we edit the graph of this metanode, we can see that it's named position, orientation, and focal for our outputs, and everything's already pretty much ready to go. You can save that out as a metanode, and I'm just going to call it camera 2, which is the name of the camera. Save it, and then at any time in any other scene you could right click, load the metanode, select that, and then be able to connect the position to the position, orientation to orientation, and the focal, which will automatically connect because it's the only number output. So if you're connecting any number to it, it won't give you a choice because there's only one number choice. And this also locks the camera in place, which is really helpful for projections because you don't want to accidentally move it. So now that we have it assigned to a constant vector amount, if I go to rotate the camera, it won't move. Any changes I want to make are completely locked to that. Changing the focal won't make any changes because it is assigned within that metanode. It will always go back to the value. And you also want to keep in mind and remember whether or not you were using the always keep level option because that will affect the position or the orientation of the camera. So if it was on when you created the projection, keep it on with the transferred camera. Another thing is keep height lock off. We can see this will lock the height of the camera above objects. Make sure that's turned off because that can cause some errors when you're trying to manipulate things or when you're trying to keep the camera in a static place. I'm going to go ahead and just disconnect the metanode so I can free the camera. But if we want to see what areas need to be improved upon if we were to create an animation, there is a little trick. That you can do to preview where the projection is within the OpenGL, and also even create renders in order to be able to see that. So if we take a look over from the side over here, we can see the stretching, where the scene kind of begins. But a nice little trick you can do is to add a spotlight into the scene and make sure it's just a regular spotlight. Quadratic spotlight will have too much fall off. You can either connect this to the metanode that you created for the projection if you made one for the main projection. I don't have one at the moment for the main camera or camera 1. I'm going to double check and see which is our main projection because I did create a duplicate camera which might have been just a move around, and it is the main camera. Another reason to create duplicate cameras is sometimes things you do in graphs will break a camera. Some tools unfortunately will break a camera when you're using a graph, and if you only have one in the scene and then it breaks, you're kind of out of luck. There's not a whole lot you can do unless the scene is saved. You can go back, but you will lose that information. So what I want to do is just create another metanode. Basically what I can do is just load in the one we just made and match these values. So we'll go into the graph, load the metanode, it's called camera 2, and we can edit and just modify these constants. So let's go ahead and change the x to 41.6.4 and negative. And then the y, negative 72.6.4. And then the z is going to be 80.662. And that should be all that's there. It looks like it is, so we'll go ahead and switch to the orientation. And we're going to change that to 76.659, and then 0 for the y, and the z is going to be 145.946. They are set up identical. Pitch, roll, and yaw is x, y, and z. The focal, if we take a look, is 45, so it's exactly the same, and we can keep it like that. Even though we're not going to be using the focal, and I am going to save this as the main camera projection. Then we can just copy the name over, save it to the title, We could add a description if we want, and that's just really saved with the file and will show up in this descriptive area. I'm going to keep it blank, just save it out. You can go ahead and delete this node. Go over to the spotlight, select its graph, and now load in that main camera projection. We can connect position to the position and the orientation to the orientation. And now our spotlight is going to match up perfectly with the camera. And you can already start to see within the OpenGL where the light is projecting. It's going to show the camera projection mainly in the top view. Of course, we do need to increase the power. Now, if you want to be more precise about the way this is going to look, and really keeping within the camera bounds, you can adjust the spread, which is currently a degree amount, to match the camera focal. So you can set up an equation to calculate between spread degree amount and focal length if you used this method a lot. Currently, I don't have any sort of calculation like that. I am going to turn off that fall off, and this is actually pretty close. It is round, of course, instead of square, so that does make a bit of a difference. So we will just need to increase the spread to go beyond. And really what you want to do is just look at the main camera view and make sure you don't see that red cone angle. Just make it a little bit larger. Now I'm going to go ahead and increase the power to 1000. And then I'm going to turn off the sunlight by clicking on its icon. And if we take a look in the top view, it's still not harsh enough. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this power to 5000. And now we can see exactly where the camera is projecting. Now, it's not super fine in the detail because this is a standard terrain. With the procedural terrain, this would show up a lot better in the OpenGL. And one thing you can do is change the color to get it to show up a little bit better. Let's go ahead and change it to a blue. And this gives you a better idea of which spots need to be improved on in order to move the camera around the scene. And exactly where you would need to position another camera to project down onto the terrain. And you can even use this to generate a mask to overlay the different layers, or create an alpha to have two different material layers, one from each projection. So of course from the front view, it's basically going to look entirely like that color. I do have, at the moment, it looks like the lighting influence turned off on these objects. So I'm going to turn off ignore lighting so that it does see that blue. Do the same thing with the other material on the other terrain. And you may notice a few spots that are not receiving the light. You can also create another version of the scene, which is basically what we're doing right now, where this projection is no longer active. So in other words, you would clear out the material just for the purpose of generating these additional maps, since we really only want to get the camera placement from this scene to bring into the other versions to render the ground layer, and then also go into the ecosystem stages of the scene and render those out. Also keeping in mind that since the ecosystem won't be 3D anymore, once it's rendered, you'll lose that depth and the animation may not look very good. So another thing you could do is take some of those ecosystem instances from the other scenes, delete most of them, but leave some of them in very key points of the scene where they really kind of stand out, just to add that depth. And all you really need to do is render out the animation of just the ecosystem with maybe an alpha and composite that on top of it. So it becomes a really good method to really separate everything because there are different anti-alias settings you need for ecosystems compared to terrains. So one thing we could do to make another version of this scene is to reset the material if needed. Basically, because we're looking so much at the slope area of these terrains, we pretty much know that anything or any change moving upward is going to create that dramatic stretching. So if we switch over to that other camera we were with before and take a look and do a quick render, you can really see where those elements are that are going to be severely stretched. So once we come up really high above the terrain, we can tell we need even more detail. And there's such a huge spot around this section, right in the middle of the scene between the foreground and the background, that has no part in the render. So therefore, we would really need to place a camera right on top of this section in order to get that detail and project from that new camera angle. You could also generate the mask by using that light, but we would need to turn off and modify the material a little. So what I want to do is clear or reset the material on both the terrains. And now you can see that a little bit better. We can see there are a few lighting errors because of the low polygon count with a standard terrain. And since we have the terrain so much larger than the scene itself, we are really zoomed in. So the amount of detail in that area is really not nearly enough. So in this case, where we have a really high amount of light, we do have some artifacts that are going to be showing. But for the most part, this would work really well for a mask. What we could do is modify the terrain to ignore the atmosphere. And what I want to set up is diffuse lighting. We're going to edit the color map. Actually, what we can do is right-click on the color map and reset it. When you reset the material, it automatically gives you that grayscale color map. When you reset a color map, it sets it to black. You can edit the color map. I'm going to set it to white. And we'll take a look at the scene. We'll need to make some atmosphere changes. Go to the atmosphere editor, set to sunlight. I'm also going to change our mode so we're not using radiosity. Let's just go ahead and use the standard lighting model. We could also use environment mapping, but just standard with the spectral. Since the sunlight is off within the scene, nothing's really going to impact that anyway. So now we go to that rocky terrain, reset the color map, edit the color, make it white. And then you can also adjust the contrast to impact the lighting if you're going to be creating any sort of alpha maps or any masks from this sort of a render. Now, if we wanted to plan out an animation, I'm going to switch over to camera 1, which is basically a duplicate of the main camera, but doesn't have any maps connected to it or anything like that. So I'm going to use this camera and kind of just figure out where maybe I'd want the animation to take place. Or maybe I just have it zooming in a little, lifting the camera up slightly. So not a huge change, but this would basically be the ending point from the original camera position. So now what I want to do is I don't want to create a copy of the spotlight just because it has a graph connected to it and I'm not sure the outcome. So I will add another spotlight into the scene. And this time, I'm not really intending on exporting any of this out. So what I'm going to do is instead of creating a metanode for the light to connect to the camera, since we have the camera in the scene, we can connect to it directly. So let's take this spotlight, edit the graph, and our new spotlight. And what we can do is add in two external dependency input nodes. And we're going to set one of them to camera 1 position and the other to camera 1 orientation. Connect the light's position to the camera's position and the orientation, and just set both of those up, and now we're going to have that light connected to this camera. So it'll also move along with it. So if we make any changes to this camera, the spotlight will move with it. Get rid of our fall off, increase our spread just so it's going outside the camera bounds, and I'm going to change this color to what would be just about opposite spectrum. Let's go ahead and do red and increase the power to 5000. And I'm going to go back to camera 2 just so we can see what is happening. So now we'd be able to tell exactly what we need from both points during the animation if we were to move between those two different areas. And if we wanted to modify this camera, maybe decide we want to see a little more over here, pick it up, that light will move with it. And now we can see the intersecting areas and what might not be taken care of with one map. And we can use these separated colors to create a mask and very easily extract from one color or another and really kind of piece together exactly what sort of either projection or additional maps we would really need to add on in order to make the scene animated. So it's really not that huge of a process. It's pretty easy to go from the matte painting we had earlier to an animated scene with the projection cameras. This also gives us a better sense of how we could set up plates for the scene. So even if we didn't intend to do any animation, we just wanted to improve certain detail elements of the scene, you can still use this technique to set up the plates. So if we turn off this other spotlight and just take a look at the scene, we can already see a couple of different areas that could easily be separated from the rest of the scene, where we have this entire front area that could easily be extracted, a small portion right around here. And if we want to turn off the other layers, we could as well. To get an idea of where the other terrain is intersecting with this one, let's go ahead and select the rocky terrain, which is the back one. And if I ignore the lighting in the atmosphere and set the color to black, it will not show up in the render. So now we know exactly where just that foreground is being impacted by the camera. And you can see a nice little outline through the scene. So we'd be able to set up different plates this way fairly easily and see that there are some very large sections that are not part of the projection and not part of the render. So that gives us a little more freedom to do more with the scene as well. We could also set this up so the color was white. And now we could have another part of a mask or a composite to work with to see exactly where the intersections are going to be. You can also see where there's bits of the terrain intersecting and coming out separately from the main piece in front, where we just have a couple little spots coming out there. So hopefully looking at the different steps taken to create that scene and going kind of beyond it, figuring out how to break it down and really look at the different elements. It'll give you a better sense of what it is you can do with Vue and really improve the quality of your scenes without having to increase polygon count, adding in tons of elements, and how you can really just kind of reduce and break things down to composites, because post-production is one of the most important parts uh, of this medium, and being able to break everything down to use it within post, I think is extremely important, and knowing how to deal with the scene and kind of go beyond certain areas of it, not having to rely entirely on direct geometry constantly, where you're rendering on a scene that's complete the entire time. In this case, with this scene, if we still had the original procedural terrains before converted to standard, the materials, all the different ecosystem elements, and then try to render out an animation with that, it's not going to be a fast solution to achieve the shot. And there are much better ways. And like I was talking about before, with leaving some of the instances in the scene to interact with maybe the breeze options or wind options is always a possibility. And being able to fine tune the animation settings for plants and going into the anti-aliasing options for objects and setting something up that really works best with plants and not having to worry about the rest of the scene and how you're going to change it. Because there are different settings needed when you're working with so many different transparency maps on all the vegetation, as opposed to rendering out fractals or rendering out the different terrains. And it's a good way to avoid flickering because everything is already there. It's already rendered. You render it once and then you can continue and create an animation very quickly. So there's really a lot you can break down, and setting up a scene like this with multipass and extracting elements is also very helpful. So there's quite a bit you can do with it, and knowing how to create extra composite shots from the existing scenes you have, merging things together, even setting up something like these lights that are attached to the cameras, just so you can know where you should have a camera projection or where you need more detail. Also figuring out if you need to have a higher res map in a specific area, because you could take one of these spotlights, tone down the power, and by having a fall off amount, be able to determine whether or not you need to break up and create a different plate, and whether or not you need to increase the resolution of a terrain and maybe have separate images so that you have something higher detailed towards and right next to the camera as opposed to farther away where you wouldn't need as much detail. So hopefully what I've covered will help you use Vue a little bit easier without any headaches.